Okay, so we will start class. This is class 8 in Beaker, Chicago, or Touching a City's Soul. And last class, we started Sikha 4, which is on page 28 in Beaker, Chicago. We are actually up to page 30 in that book. But in just to review the beginning of the Sikha, the beginning of the point that was being made, the previous Rebbe was saying that a sense of orderliness, seder in Hebrew, is very important, and it can secure, in his words, it can secure success in life and the creativity of the individual to have things in an orderly fashion, and especially of a group. And he talked about how the Hasidic masters who founded Hasidus were blessed with many gifts, and one of them was this sense of orderliness, and how just like a physical artisan requires tools to be able to do his job and practice his craft, spiritual artisans need to have spiritual tools to be able to practice their craft. And the example he gave was that a wise man who is wise and who fears sin may be likened to a craftsman with tools in his hand. And although he says that the idea of comparing spiritual work to physical work is incomparable and it's such a big difference, but still there is some connection. And the idea that a spiritual craftsman needs to have spiritual tools, in this case, the example was given was fear of sin, and that a physical craftsman also requires tools. And the one that he wants to focus on, or the one that he started with, was a sense of orderliness. He also mentioned that the next part about how when the Hasidic masters wanted to, or when anybody wants to start a new particular school of thought, and he applied it to the Hasidic masters, there needs to be self-sacrifice in order to do that, and that the Hasidic masters had self-sacrifice in order to establish Hasidus, and that one of the tools that they used in order to establish it was this sense of orderliness. So that's sort of what we did last class, and what we're up to the bottom of page 30. And what the previous Rebbe is going to do now is he wants to take that idea of orderliness, and he's sort of giving an example of how this sense of orderliness helped to establish Hasidus and he's picking one area to expound upon. And that area is going to be the way that the Rebbeim sent mashpiyim, spiritual mentors, to different cities to help guide the people. So that's that basically this whole section is going to be talking about an example of that, and how they would guide a city, and an example of like a teaching that they taught people to help them grow spiritually. And that's all going to circle back, and that's going to be an example of this sense of orderliness that the Hasidic masters utilized in order to help grow the teachings of Hasidus to become rooted and founded. So again, it's going to feel like it's digressing a little bit, because the story is going to become very involved. The point of the story is this example, basically. We don't know why the previous Rebbe chose this story, but we could imagine that the reason why he chose it is because he feels it's a lesson that he wanted the listeners to also hear, because he could have chosen anything, right? So he chose this, and there's a specific teaching that was taught through the story, and I guess he felt it was important for us to know that teaching. Okay, so again, at the bottom of page 30, this is basically one example or manner of this idea of how the Hasidic masters exhibited this sense of orderliness. So this characteristic is diversified, affecting the lives of individuals, families, and entire communities. The characteristic of orderliness is diversified, but the particular aspect on which I would like to focus is the manner in which mashpiyim are appointed in the Hasidic community. Mashpiyim, again, are spiritual mentors, and there was a time when a Rebbe would send a mashpiyah to a certain community, like he was appointed to go to that place to be their spiritual mentor. As a title, the word mashpia signifies a person who transmits teachings, maamarim, those are Hasidic discourses, and oral traditions to the Hasidim of his community. At a deeper level, that word refers to the spiritual influence that he shares with them. So there's like two levels, right? There's the sort of the external level of his influence, which is the teachings that he teaches, classes and so on. And on the deeper level, it refers to the influence, the spiritual influence that this mashpia has on the community. Traditionally, the personal status of the mashpiyim has been varied. Sometimes the mashpia was the community's rav, their rabbi, or the local halachic authority, or the sheikhet, the ritual slaughterer, or the malamed, the teacher in the cheder, right? Those could have been the mashpiyim for the community. Sometimes he occupied none of the above positions. He was simply the mashpia, the spiritual mentor, who alone was responsible for guiding his community towards the spiritual lifestyle of Chassidut. In the third generation of the Nesiim of Chabad in the times of the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the third Chabad Rebbe, a system was instituted whereby Hasidic mashpiyim were dispatched to settle in the towns and villages in which there were Chabad Hasidim. In other words, the Tzemach Tzedek actually set up a system that he sent mashpiyim out to the different communities where Hasidim were living. Their work was tailored to match the local conditions. For example, the regular sessions for the study of Hasidus were organized separately for full-time scholars and working householders, right? So full-time scholars had different maybe level and different timing, and the working people had different timing and different levels, right? They were at different points. But at the loving and camaraderie Farbrengens held in honors of festival days, meaning the Hasidic festival days, in the Hasidic calendar, they would all join together, whether scholarly or unlettered, whether rich or poor, as equals. So there were some things that they had to do separately, obviously the classes, that both for probably the timing and the content and the level. But the Farbrengens, everybody came together. So this is what the mashpiyim would do in these towns that the Tzemach Tzedek sent them to. So now he's going to tell over basically he's going to follow one like history of how a certain mashpia got to a certain town, and then he's going to tell one story about what he said to people to help guide them spiritually, which is going to be quite a strong message, just a little warning here. But of course, the way that the previous Rebbe does it is he has this whole buildup of all these details and lots of names and this person and who he was and who his uncle was and who his grandfather was and what his background was. He's going to give a lot of details that's going to sort of make this a richer experience. So he's going to be talking about a certain town. He's going to first talk about how this town was established by the Tzemach Tzedek, like with all the details of how the town was established. Okay, so the following descriptions relate to the year 5619 or 1859, about 15 years after my great-grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek, had bought at his own expense a large tract of land in the Minsk region, extending over 3,500 desiats, however much that is in today's, with miles or kilometers. I'm not sure. It included dense forests and substantial stretches of rich black soil, as well as meadows and streams. And there he founded the Shedrin farming settlement, a pioneering project in his plan to attract Jews to agriculture. So he bought this land with his own money, and then he started to settle Jewish people there. He settled there over 300 families. Their work earned them a comfortable living. And at certain seasons, they were able to devote their free time to Torah study. And he was trying to help the Hasidim materially and spiritually. Each family received, without any payment on their part, a block of land on which they could build a home and whatever buildings that their farming work required, as well as a garden patch and an area in which they could grow pasture for their cattle and horses. So they really had a whole package. Each family of settlers also enjoyed certain governmental privileges, including a loan of 200 rubles in cash from the official treasury of Bais, to be repaid by future harvest. So they're also trying to get the land settled. So Tzemach Tzedek bought it and gave it to these 300 families to settle. But this is how he divided it up. My great-grandfather divided up the area of the 3,500 deciats as follows. About 1,700 deciats of pasture land, forest, and meadows were divided up among the families of settlers, those 300 families. The remaining area, about 1,800 deciats of forests, he sold to a wealthy Hasidic individual called Rebbe Yosef Golodetz. His name is going to come up again, who lived in Bobroisk. So he divided it basically in half. Half he settled these 300 families on, and half he sold to this wealthy person. Part of the payment was to be made at the time of purchase, and part was to be paid in installments over the years. Of the amount received at the time, my great-grandfather sent part to Koil Chabad fund in Eretz Yisrael. This fund, Koil Chabad, is something that his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, started to support the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And it's actually, we've talked about that in the past, that it's actually a custom to give money to Koil Chabad at least every Erev Shabbos, have a pushka by your Shabbos candles to give money to, and I think at one of the luncheons, I think we actually gave out pushkas for Koil Chabad. And the other part, he deposited in his tzedakah fund, which supported communal needs and also needy individuals. So half he gave to the families, half he sold. So the money that came in, he sent a large chunk to Eretz Yisrael, and the other chunk he set, the other part he set aside for a tzedakah fund. So he didn't take any money, personally from this sale. Several members of the Golodetz family settled in Shedrin so they could conduct their timber business there with that half of that land that their family member had purchased. Okay, so that's the background. This person's Ephraim Yosef is gonna come up again, in passing a few times in the story. So you could remember his name he's the landowner. He's not the main protagonist of the story. Okay, like many Hasidic towns and villages, the farming community of Shedrin originally had its own mashpia. In addition to its halachic authority, its sheikhtim, the ritual slaughters, and its maamarim, its teachers for cheder. This mashpia was Rabbi Yerucham Fischel Yanovitcher, and after the passing of years, the time came for a successor to be found. So this story is going to be about his successor and what he taught the families there, basically. So Rabbi Yerucham Fischel was the first mashpia. He's not the one who the story is about. He's sort of retired, I guess, when he, at a certain point, and a new mashpia was found for the community. Now, the well-known chassid Rebbe Tzal Ozeritcher had an old friend called Rebbe Yisrael Moshe. This Rebbe Yisrael Moshe is going to become this next mashpia, and he's going to be talked about again and again. So he had an old friend called Rebbe Yisrael Moshe, a man of outstanding erudition and refinement of character, who had a close bond with the Tzemach Tzedek and was constantly immersed in Torah and Avodah. That Avodah is spiritual work, spiritual refinement. In addition, his mind was sharp and he was well loved. Throughout some decades of full-time study, he had been supported by his father-in-law, Reb Chaim Yosef, a storekeeper in Ozerich and a chassid of the Mitzler Rebbe. He had been a malamed for a few years, and in 1852, about 10 years after my great-grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek, had founded the Shedrin farming community, he decided to appoint Rebbe Yisrael Moshe as the mashpia in that community and successor to Rebbe Yerucham Fischel Yanovitcher. So this is how he's being introduced, right? Rebbe Yisrael Moshe is this mashpia number 2 of Shedrin, and he's very refined character, very learned. His father-in-law was a chassid, and so on. And now, at all times, the mashpiyim, these spiritual mentors at every Hasidic Shofar used to share a brief expression which would develop into the focus of all the following talks and narratives, and thus would remain forever engraved in the memories of those present. They would start with an idea and then develop that idea, build it out, build it out, and build it out. Rabbi Yisrael Moshe, by nature, was very deliberate and punctual. and expected everyone who attended the community's regular study sessions to arrive exactly on time. That was his expectation. He was like that, and that was his expectation. Any latecomer would be called to order and given the stern admonition that he deserved. When Rabbi Yisrael Moshe urged someone to earnestly consider what was the purpose of his life, he was most articulate. He could describe that person's ethical and spiritual state so clearly that by the time the listener took his leave, he felt contrite and battered, a sinful and worthless fool overcome by shame. However, it's not because he was harsh, as the next paragraph says. Yet his unique and characteristic approach to people was basically mild. He never raised his voice, never used harsh words of rebuke, but would modify his style to suit the listener facing him. He would discuss a moral flaw in a way that showed how the relevant listener was to be pitied, but that's a hard word in English, but it means like compassion. In other words, not judged. It's a positive thing, but would express himself in such language that every word of his found its way into the depths of his listener's heart. That's why the person felt contrite and battered, meaning he wasn't harsh or mean-spirited. He was never used harsh words, never raised his voice. It's just that he was so on the mark that they felt like, oh my gosh, he's right. I really have to correct this. And as every phrase touched that listener's innermost soul strings, he was brought to tears. Again, he wasn't being harsh. He was just really getting accurate. And then the person would be like, oh no. Rabbi Yisrael Moshe's talent for description was exceptional. Regardless of whether he was depicting an event or someone's appearance or conduct, his listeners saw the picture before their eyes as clearly as if he had painted a portrait. Kind of like the previous Rebbe, right? He also has a big gift of describing things where you also feel like you're just like plopped right into the middle of the story. So he was also that way. So I guess that also, because of that, it probably also affected people when he spoke about things, because they really related and they could really picture what he was saying in a very real way. So all of those things together configured that he really touched people deeply when he talked to them about their spiritual levels and what they needed to work on and their connection to Hashem. So this was a gift that he had. And remember, his appointment is being told in the context of this was the characteristic called orderliness, is what the Rebbeim used to help create Hasidim and Hasidus, to have it be rooted in the world. So this orderliness, the example that the Friedrich was giving is how they used it to appoint mashpiyim. And now that he's talking about that quality, he's giving an example of how a mashpiyah was appointed, and then further showing how this mashpiyah affected people. So it's in the back context of like, that's how they're being built up. Hasidim and Hasidus is by using this sense of orderliness, one way to send mashpiyim, and those mashpiyim would affect the people who they would talk to, and then people would become closer to the Eibishter, more refined, and so on. And so like, those are like the ripple effects of this quality of orderliness. Basically, that's like the context. But what's going to happen is he's going to tell a story. He's going to share a story of how, give a background and then like a story of how this mashpia affected the people.
So Chaya, where are you reading? I'm kind of lost.
We're in the middle of page 33.
Okay.
After the 3 dots. We're about to start like the next subsection.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay. So on Shavuos 56, which is 1896, I heard the following recollections from a chassid by the name of Reb Avram Dov, the son of Rabbi Yirmiyahu. Now, the Friedrich was going to go in and tell us who Avram Dov is and like a whole background to who he is. But then he's going to go back to talk about this recollection, and this recollection is going to be a story of this mashpia Yisrael Moshe and how he affected people. But for a minute, we're going to divert a little bit to give, once we mention this person, the Friedrich was going to tell you all about him, and then he's going to go into this person's recollections of this event, basically of this Farbrengen. So this Rabbi Avram Dov had a maternal uncle called Reb Lev Yitzchak. This Lev Yitzchak is Avram Dov's uncle, and Avram Dov is about to share a recollection, basically. So this person is about to share a recollection. He has an uncle, a vintage chassid of Alt Rebbe, and a mellow master of both Nigla and Chassidus. In other words, a very learned person in all aspects of Torah, and he was a special chassid of Alt Rebbe. He had been a businessman all his life, first as a prominent storekeeper in Hummel, and later as the manager of Rebbe Ephraim Yosef Holodetz's interest in the forest of Shadrin. Remember, he was that landowner, he owned half of the land. So this Rebbe Lev Yitzchak was at first a store owner, and then he became the manager of that half of that plot that the Tzemach Tzedek had sold to this Ephraim Yosef. Throughout his years in Hummel, he had entrusted his spiritual growth to the guidance of the eminent Reb Isaac of Hummel. Now that was his mashpia, this uncle. Whenever Reb Isaac expounded Chassidus publicly, he was always one of the first to arrive, and he would often visit him to discuss his studies in Nigla, and especially in Chassidus. In fact, Reb Isaac used to say that with Reb Lev Yitzchak, this uncle, he could discuss such matters freely because his ear not only listens, it also discerns. So they're telling you, the Friedrich was sharing how special this Avram Dov, who's about to share his recollections, how special his uncle was. His uncle was a very person of very fine character and very learned, so much so that this great chassid, Rebbe Isaac of Hummel, who was known to be a very great chassid, felt like he could discuss things freely with him because he was very, he understood and discerned things more deeply than the average person. So Ephraim Dov is going to share something. Rebbe Ephraim Dov recalled, and this is not even, this is like some recollections. It's not even going to be the main one yet, right? Like Avram Dov recalled, from the age of bar mitzvah until I turned 17, in 5603 or 1843, my father took me to Lubavitch to study under the Tzemach Tzedek in the yeshiva there. And whenever I had free times from my studies, whether on weekdays or Shabbos or Yantif, I would always spend it at my uncle, Reb Lev Itcha. This uncle, who we just heard about, who was so special and so refined and was the manager of the forests and so close to Reb Isaac Hummel. So he would study in Lubavitch and he would spend his free time with Reb Lev Itcha. He devoted, it's another way of saying Yitzchak. He devoted time to telling me all about his childhood, his teachers, and his early studies. So now this is Rebbe Ephraim Dov talking about his uncle telling him about his childhood. His father, who was my grandfather, right, this is his uncle, Reb Elia Shaul, was quite a scholar. He had virtually memorized 2 of the 6 Sedarim of the Gemara, namely Nashim and Nezikin, together with the commentaries of Tosfos. A paid helper attended to his dry goods stores while he sat in a corner and pursued his studies. In other words, he's a store owner, but he didn't spend most of his time managing the store. He hired somebody to manage the store. He just sat in the store and learned Torah all day. So also a man of very fine quality. So this is this Avraham Dov's grandfather, who's the father of this uncle. That grandfather, the store owner who was very learned, Reb Eliashah, was born a Misnagid and remained a Misnagid, except that he was one of those who utterly shunned controversy and avoid taking sides with either party. In other words, he wasn't a chassid. The grandfather wasn't a chassid. The uncle was a chassid, but the grandfather wasn't. However, he had a friend from his youth called Reb Tanchum Shlomo, known as the Maggid of Belitz, who was not simply a misnagid, but a person who hated the sect with a passion. The sect is another term for the chassidim. So this grandfather had a friend who was not only misnagid, but he was a very vocal misnagid. In fact, he had been a member of the rabbinical court of Vilna, headed by the Gaon of Reb Shmuel. Remember Reb Shmuel from our previous story, who's married the mother of the protagonist and became and the protagonist married his daughter, so like they became related in different ways. Okay, so he was a member of the rabbinical court of the Vilna, headed by the Gaon Reb Shmuel, who had issued a decree of excommunication against the Baal Shem Tov's disciple, the Maggid of Mezrich, and his disciples. So again, his uncle was Rabbi Avram Dov's uncle was a chassid. His grandfather was a misnagid who stayed out of the controversy, but his grandfather had a friend who was right in the thick of the controversy. Now, my uncle, Rebbe Rayatz, this chassid, had studied industriously for several years under Tanchum Shlomo, who was this very virulent misnagid, who was known as the Parish of Belitz. So one can easily guess how intensely the young student was influenced by him. So in other words, he grew up being a misnagid and being influenced by people who are very, very anti-Hasidim. It was only by virtue of the workings of divine providence that the two scholarly brothers, my uncle's best friends, had joined the Hasidic Brotherhood, and that he too found himself growing closer to Hasidim until he himself became a deeply rooted Hasid. In other words, the grandfather was a misnagid, but a quiet one, and his son, the uncle of this boy, grew up that way, but he became a Hasid. When my uncle eventually settled in Shadrin, I used to go to visit him a couple of times a year. That was already after the time of Rabbi Yochum Fischel, the Mashpia of Shadrin. That was Mashpia number 1 that we heard about. And in his place, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, had sent Rabbi Yisrael Moshe of Ozerich, that was Mashpia number 2, who was soon renowned throughout the entire region. So again, this Chassid Avram Dov is saying that his uncle became a Chassid. His uncle lived in Shadrin. He was the one who was managing that half of that region, and he was very enamored of this second mashpia. And when Avram Dov, would go visit his uncle, he would see his uncle, and his uncle would talk about the mashpia. And then he's also going to talk about one time when he was at a farbrengen with this mashpia. My uncle was very fond of the new mashpia, who related to him with the deepest respect. My uncle would participate in every Hasidic farbrengen. There he would share recollections of his earliest years before he became a chassid, of his first years as a chassid, and of how he visited the Alter Rebbe for the first time in the Yashna, and also events from time to time of the Mitzvah Rebbe. His words always left a deep impression on the listeners. This is his uncle, this is Avram Dov's uncle, Rebbe Rayatz, who became a chassid and moved to Shadrin and was, monitoring those forests. That he would go to the farbrengens with this second mashpia, and he would share there about his life story and about how he became a chassid and everything else. And he influenced people very deeply. Rabbi Avram Dov added, right? This is the chassid who's talking, and who the Friedrich Rebbe is saying, I heard from Avram Dov these stories, right? Rabbi Avram Dov added, I was always eager to be present whenever Chassidus was being taught by the Mashpia of Rabbi Yisrael Moshe. That's Mashpia number 2 of Shadrin, right? Whether he was discussing Haskalah or Aveda, meaning whether he was discussing something deep in learning or something in a person's spiritual growth, his explanations were always rich and precise. And they were often accompanied by a narrative which not only clarified the subject at hand, but also engraved it in the minds and hearts of his listeners. So this is the chassid. Avram Dov is talking about how he himself was affected so much when he would go to visit his uncle who lived in Shadrin by this second mashpia's farbrengens, and how he would always want to go and listen to them, and how much this mashpia really affected people. The spiritual pleasure generated by his farbrengens was even more exceptional, meaning he engraved something in the minds and hearts of the person, but there was also this spiritual pleasure, it sounds so amazing, right? So beautiful. His gift for portrayal was so graphic that if you closed your eyes while he spoke, you forgot where you were. You imagined that you literally saw the situation that he was describing, or that you were actually there. That was this mashpia number 2, right? This mashpia, Rabbi Yisrael Moshe, he had this gift. So he had a gift to explain concepts in Chassidus. He had a gift to explain things that touch their minds, things that touch their hearts, and to describe stories and events in such a way that it just a person felt like they were there and they experienced it themselves. So this is obviously a very special person. This is all the background that the previous Rebbe is giving us to the story that he's about to say. And in this story that he's about to say, he's going to actually share one of the teachings that this Rabbi Yisrael Moshe shared with his listeners at a Farbrengen. Meaning all of this is like explaining the background and the buildup and how, and again, how did the Hasidic masters use this quality of orderliness to affect the growth of Hasidus and Hasidic communities? One example is by sending a mashpia. And now, like, when we're talking about this mashpia, we need to hear who he was and what his background was and how he got there. And then we're going to hear from somebody who was actually at one of his Farbrengens what he taught. But in order to like appreciate what this person is going to share, we have to know about him and his uncle and his grandfather, right? And like who he was. So now that we have like all those pieces in place, that this was the second mashpia who was appointed to Shadrin, and this is the recollections of Avram Dov, whose uncle was this great chassan, and grandfather was a Misnaga, but a peaceful Misnaga, and he went to visit his uncle, and he was present at one of these Farbrengens. So now he's gonna explain, like he's gonna share his recollections of one of these Farbrengens. Okay, are we doing okay, ladies? Okay. It's really helpful to probably reread this later, but anyway. So in the year 5616, late 1855, Rebbe Avram Dov further recalled, I spent Hanukkah with my uncle, Rebbe Leib Itcha, in Shadrin. Now, according to the local custom, the Farbrengen celebrating Hasidic red letter days, such as Yud Kislev and Yud Kislev and the 5th day of Hanukkah, were held in one big Bais Medrash in the evening and in the other big Bais Medrash on the following day. That year, the 5th day of Hanukkah was a Sunday, and Sunday and Wednesday were the 2 weekly market days on which the townsmen earned most of their livelihood from the surrounding villagers who converged on Shadrin. At the rich Farbrengen on Motzei Shabbos, the eve of the 5th night, the Bais Medrash was packed. After Shachris the next morning, a large group assembled for the second session, but since many Hasidim could not attend because it was a market day, it was decided to defer the main Farbrengen until that evening after Ma'ariv, so that everybody could come, because Sunday was a market day, so it was like a work day, so people couldn't stay to hear the Farbrengen after Shachris. So instead of having the Farbrengen Motzei Shabbos and Sunday after Shachris, they decided to have the Farbrengen Motzei Shabbos and Sunday night. Rabbi Yisrael Moshe, remember that's Mashpia number 2. Rabbi Yisrael Moshe was displeased that some of them who were stall keepers came late, meaning the Farbrengen was Sunday night, so the work was officially finished, but they still came late. In his eyes, this indicated not only that they were being complacent with regard to the time-honored Hasidic tradition of Farbrengen, right? They came late to the Farbrengen, so that means they're not taking it seriously enough. It also indicated that in their lives, matter was prevailing over form. Okay, if you look at the footnote, their material interests eclipsed their spiritual aspirations. In the Hasidic terms, in the original are Chaimer and Surah. So in general, Chaimer refers to material, physical, and Surah refers to the form, like a more spiritual. So if their business was more, so to speak, more important to them than their spiritual growth, then that was an indication that matter was prevailing over form. If their spiritual growth would be more important to them than their business, that would be an indication that their form was prevailing over matter. So the fact was that they came late to the Farbrengen, and what Rabbi Yisrael Moshe felt from that was 2 things. They were complacent in regards to the Hasidic minhag of having a Farbrengen, and that their matter was prevailing over form in their mindsets. It was bad enough that their business, albeit a necessity, overrode their attendance at a Hasidic Farbrengen, but even when their business was over, meaning it was the evening, it had cooled down their haste to arrive there on time. So if they had arrived on time as soon as their business was over, it'd be like, okay, well, they couldn't come when their business was open, they couldn't come, but they were upset about that. Like that wasn't what they wished would have happened. So as soon as they were finished, they would run to the Farbrengen. That would be okay, right? But he's feeling that the fact that they didn't come on time means it wasn't so important to them to begin with, and when they could come, it still wasn't so important, right? It's a very refined. He's expecting a very high level, and he's noticing a very refined thing. Like I don't know if it's even something we would notice today if somebody came late. So if I bring, you know what I'm saying? Like that's probably even worse about us, or about, you know, but like whatever, you know, like that was his reaction. Okay. Accordingly, Rabbi Saul Moshe's theme at that Farbrengen was Adam Harishon. He decided to speak about Adam. That's what, remember we said earlier, the previous Rebbe said earlier that a mashpia would pick a topic and like that's what he would start with, and then he would like develop it into a lot of details and practical applications and so on. So he decided at that Farbrengen to talk about Adam Harishon, the first man who was created. He pointed out that Adam was created by the hands of the Holy One, blessed be He, right? That's, if you look in Bereshis, that's what Hashem formed him from the Adama, the earth. That's why he was called Adam, and then blew an neshama into him. As opposed to everything else where it says, and God said this, and then it became, and God said this, and it became, right? So he formed Adam, and his body was so luminous that even his heel dimmed the sun. That's what the Medrash says, meaning his body wasn't so physical. It was physical, but it wasn't like the physical that would mask the godly or cover over the godliness. It was luminous. So the godliness of his neshama shone through his body, as opposed to today where our bodies sort of cover up our godliness. And his wisdom outshone the wisdom of the ministering angels, another Medrash says, notwithstanding their lofty nature, meaning Adam, his physical was godly and his understanding and wisdom even was higher than the angels, who are pretty high, right? They're spiritual beings. Yet, by succumbing to the sin of the tree of knowledge, that mighty Adam was reduced to a pathetic nebuch, like a Torah sage who has forgotten his scholarship, or like a magnate after a fire. Right? That's what he's describing to Adam. It's like Adam sort of lost that status by eating from the Eitz Hadas. When he heard all the punishments God was giving him as a result of his sin, he uttered not a word, because he recognized the enormity of his sin. Like he accepted it. However, when he heard that when he sowed grain in the soil, it will sprout thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the grass of the field, I mean, that was one of the results, that was more than he could take. The tears gushed forth as he cried out, Master of the universe, so I and my donkey will eat from the very same trough? Meaning, I'm going to be like an animal, right? And the tears gushed forth. Rabbi Yisrael Moshe now focused on his late coming listeners. God made every man in the mold of Adam, meaning we were all created in the image of Adam, right? We have physical and we have a spiritual, and Adam was a neshama klaus, a piece of Adam in us. But added that just as their faces are not identical, so too their dispositions are not identical. Meaning we're all created similarly, but we're not all the same. Today's Adams don't gush tears. In fact, they are even quite content to eat in the same trough as their donkey, because in them matter prevails over form. The previous doesn't explain what he meant by this, but I guess we could guess that he's talking about the idea that, the physical and the physical needs of making a living and eating, they're behaving the way that somebody who's just putting matter over form, their physical needs in front of their spiritual needs. It's like an animal who just takes care of their physical needs without any thought to their spiritual needs. And so he sort of reprimanded them through this teaching. So that's the crux of the lesson, that's the end of this story, meaning the previous Rebbe is telling this buildup of you need to have gifts in order to, there needs to be, there were gifts of the Hasidic masters in order to further Hasidus. And one of the gifts and one of the tools, and there needs to be gifts and tools, and one of the gifts and tools that they had was this sense of orderliness. And one of the ways that they implemented that was by appointing mashpiyim, and then who this mashpiyah was, and then give an example of what is a lesson that a mashpiyah might tell a community, and under what circumstances might they do it. So here's the lesson, right? Like these few lines are the lesson that the mashpiyah chose to share with people who he felt were putting their material needs were giving more importance and more attention than their spiritual needs. Because again, he's not saying they shouldn't take care of their material needs. If they can't come to the Fabrengen because they have to work and they have to monitor their stalls, that's sad, but it's not bad. It's just okay that people have to work, so they have to work. But where's their head? Is their head in their work so that even when work is over, they still come late to a Fabrengen? Or is their head like, yes, I have to do this because I have to do this, but now it's time for a Fabrengen, so I'm gonna get there, rush there, be there right on time so I don't miss any words, because now I'm not working and I can't be there, so I'm gonna be there and I'm gonna be fully present and I'm gonna be there. And that's the story. Basically, this whole buildup is these few lines. Now, I certainly cannot tell you why the previous Rebbe decided to use this tool of orderliness and the example of orderliness as appointing mashpiyim, and the story that he chose of a mashpiyah is this story, right? We don't know, but that is the one that he chose to share in Chicago to the group of people who he was speaking to. And I guess the lessons are timely lessons. There's a very famous story. I think it was with Tzemach Tzedek actually, where it may have been with Alter Rebbe, I'm not sure, where Chassid came to him and said, talking about his business, and he was in the galoshes business, and the Rebbe said to him, I've heard of a person putting their foot in galoshes, but never a person putting their head in galoshes, meaning again, sort of like a little too much attention is being put on the business and not enough attention on the spiritual growth. So a person should do what they need to do to earn a living, of course, and then when they have an opportunity to do something for their spiritual growth, the enthusiasm with which they do that shows what their main sort of goal is or focus is for themselves. Okay, so then there's another example of this idea that Rabbi Yisrael Moshe said before he became mashpia, when he was still a teacher in the house of this landowner. Remember, we said at first he was a teacher in that household. So there's also going to be another story of him, much shorter, but we already have the whole buildup of who he was and everything else. So the previous Rebbe goes on to say, I heard the following in Teves, 1901, 1902, 56, 62, from Reb Shmuel Zanvil, an emissary who raised funds for the Rebbe's institutions. In his earlier years, he had been employed as a resident Melamed in the household of Rebbe Ephraim Yosef of Halot in Shedrin. Remember, that's that main landowner. So at a lively and fruitful Fabrengen that accompanied a major family celebration there in this household of Rebbe Ephraim Yosef, who was that main landowner, in 5619, 1859, the dominant speaker was Rebbe Yisrael Moshe, who earnestly admonished his wealthy listeners for their lax, maybe he wasn't mashpia right at that time, who earnestly admonished his wealthy listeners for their lax attitude to the regular local sessions for group study and for their late coming to the shiurim of Hasidus and to Fabrengens. His hosts listened and offered the well-worn excuse that the fault lay in the pressure of business. In response, the mashpia, this Rabbi Yisrael Moshe, this mashpia discussed the divine assurance that the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do, and that it is the blessing of God that grants wealth. these are 2 psukim in Torah, right? So this is kind of interesting the way he puts it. His listeners were responsive to his words, which he concluded with a whimsical question. Why should you help the master of the universe? Rather help yourselves. Meaning God says he's going to bless you in all that you do, and it's the blessing of God that grants wealth. So if it's the blessing of God that grants wealth, why should you help God so much? He's going to make sure you're wealthy. Help yourself. Do your spiritual work. God's not going to do your spiritual work for you, but he is going to make sure that the blessing of Hashem grants you wealth, right? So why should you spend time helping the master of the universe? Do his job. He can do his own job. His job is to give you parnasa. Rather help yourselves. Do your spiritual work, grow in the spiritual way that you need to grow, because that you have to do. Hashem's not going to do it for you. That's kind of, like he said, whimsical question, right? He's like trying to teach that idea. Anyway, these are 2 stories of this Rabbi Yisrael Moshe, this mashpia, and his, I guess, like perspective of the importance of making sure that people are taking their spiritual journeys seriously and to heart. And that's what the previous was saying, that's what the mashpiim of the communities would do. Their job was to encourage and inspire the people who lived in those communities to keep growing in a ruchnistic way. So we can understand that sending mashpiim to those communities to do those things is the very fabric of making sure that people are growing, communities are growing in Torah mitzvahs and in Chassidus. They would teach them Chassidus. And so again, we're going backwards now, so we can understand why that would be such an important thing to establish the teachings of Torah mitzvahs Chassidus, and and doing that in an orderly way would be key to making sure that it happens in a way that's going to affect people. And therefore that quality of orderliness is something that was very important for the Chassidim, for the Chassidic masters, as the Friedrich Rebbe calls them, to have. So that's his point, and that's a story that he uses to back up the point. And the idea that just like physical craftsmen need to have tools, spiritual craftsmen need to have tools, and orderliness is one of those tools. Okay, questions or comments?
Don't you think it's even harder today?
Harder today than it was then, you're saying?
Yeah. There's so many more distractions and things to, not make you as orderly about your ruchnius.
I mean, it's hard to know if it's harder today because I didn't live then, there's definitely a lot more distractions, or different kinds of distractions than was then. And I think also, Baruch Hashem, the Eibush has given us a lot more tools than we had then too. There's so many things available at our fingertips to help us grow spiritually as well, that they also didn't have. I don't know, meaning, I don't know how to answer that question. It could be.
It seems like they were on a much higher level because
Yes.
they had less.
Yes, they were yes, I would 100% agree with that. It does seem that they were on a much higher level, much more refined in the kinds of things that they were working on, right? Much more refined. And hearing those stories and learning about what they were working on and how they were working, I think can help us strengthen ourselves to whatever the next thing is that we could work on, right? Yes, it does feel like they were definitely on a much higher level, much more aware of details of spiritual growth and things like that,
And Hasidus is timeless.
Yeah, like Torah is timeless.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me. Baruch Hashem. Thank you so much.
Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, yeah. Any other
Yeah,
questions?
it's hard to accept that they had so a different line of thinking. I mean, in our day and age, I don't know very many people that will think this way.
Think about the importance of spiritual growth versus material growth. Well, I think that's what Hasidus tries to teach us to do now too, right? I think that
Yes, but you try to teach us. They lived it. It came natural for them.
they had mashpiyim who were able to paint these pictures, like the previous Rebbe was saying, right?
Talking about pictures, I could not open your file. Please send it through WhatsApp.
Okay, I also did send it out through WhatsApp, but maybe not to you. Okay, I'll have to check if you're on my,
Thank you.
why you didn't get it. It's strange. About the book-
Also,
yeah,
also illustrating their higher level, it was remarkable how they responded to, even though he was kind and understood Reb Yisrael Moshe and understood how to relate to them, but that they accepted those rebukes and in public in such a way, I think is speaks to the high level that they were on.
it's an interesting thing that you're mentioning, and that's a hallmark of what a Hasidic Farbrengen was in that time period. It was about people sort of telling people what they needed to work on, almost. You know what I'm saying? It was a very vulnerable experience. I mean, there was obviously more, right? It was teachings and everything else, but I'm saying there was a true spirit of everybody's in this together and helping each other. And yeah, I think we're much more sensitive today.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so
they were so focused on spiritual growth that they saw it as a help in their spiritual growth.
correct. That is exactly correct.
And to their person, to like, how dare you say that about me?
Right. That was not the reaction. The reaction was like, oh no, I better work on this.
I think it's kind of like that closeness to Hashem. So seeing yourself as a creation of Hashem, that I'm trying to improve, what Hashem created, not like I'm my own property.
That's really interesting. And I think too, in addition to that, I think it was also something about how close they were to each other. They were sort of like brothers. It was called the Hasidic Brotherhood, but they're in a small town. They all knew each other. They knew each other for years, or they knew each other. So it was almost like family, extended family. And I think if a family member told us they wanted us to work on something, we might take it differently than if a person who we knew said it, in a Farbrengen, you know what I'm saying? But I think they almost felt that way about each other, that closeness was there at a different level. And I think today, when we live very separate lives, we're in houses spread apart with sidewalks and driveways, you know what I mean? Like, whereas people sort of live on top of each other, and they had communal ovens, and they had, you know what I mean? Like, everybody was sort of like, I think it was a different style of living, community living.
Can you imagine yourself sharing an oven with somebody else?
I mean, that's what people did, right? I mean, some people had their own ovens, and some people just brought, everybody brought their bread to be baked. You know what I mean? Like, there was different types of living. People lived. It was a different style.
It was a different era.
It was a different era, right? So I think it also contributed to being willing and able to hear what people said, because they were close in a different way. Not that people aren't close today, but they were almost close, like families are close.
Well, and that's what the Frierdiker Rebbe illustrates so wonderfully.
Right.
That feeling. When I'm reading this, I always feel that I'm being brought into his family. That I understand more about what it was like to be a chassid. a true chassid in those days at that time. It's just fantastic because you never get this kind of intimacy anymore by reading someone's account of somebody's life. This is truly intimate. I'm just sitting there listening to a family story, but I'm part of that family, and that is just truly, it's transcendent. Really, is how I feel.
Malka said it was very inspiring to just listen a minute ago to Malka when she said that we are one family, and Chaya said that all Israel Achim, we try to bring everybody together. So I'm taking the liberty to dedicate the class today in memory of all the soldiers that left us because they protected the land of Israel. And the first one, according, there are 29,000 and something, but who was the first one? The first one was not at the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948. The first one was in 1812. That's when they start counting. And so for all those neshamot, all the 29,700 and however many, may they have a aliyat neshamayim, the merit that we getting closer.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Okay. Well, I see this was very meaningful and certainly thought-provoking for all of us.
Can I just ask something quickly? What's about the red letter days? What is it? I see what days they're talking about, but what's the significance, or what does it why mean? Are they called that? Yeah.
I mean, it's just an expression. Like, it's something that stands out. Red letter day means something that stands out. It's like it's probably not an expression that's in use anymore in the English language, but it was an expression that just means something that stands out, that's noticeable. So there's Hasidic special days that are days that traditionally Hasidim fabring. So that's what that is about. Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Always need an excuse to get together and speak to. So sometimes it's in the memory of somebody, and sometimes it's for a simcha, and sometimes it's just because it's a nice day outside.
Okay. Well, everybody should have a good day.
Amen.
Should be well.
Please send me the picture.
Thank you